Hello, guys. What's good? We got on a very special guest today, Professor Gerald Horne. You may know him for his many works that revisit American history and radically rewrite them from a new perspective. Professor Horne, do you want to introduce yourself?
Well, thank you for inviting me, writer, historian, activist, lawyer, etc.
Good to have you on. Good to have you on. My first question, and just getting right into it, is that a lot of your work has been redefining a lot of American revolutions, Texas's independence, the American Revolutionary War, as counter-reactionary attempts by slave owners to hold on to power. Why is this the case? Was it because slavery was such an important part of like pre Civil War economies or even post Civil War economies?
Well, slavery is profitable. In one of my books, I point out that the African slave trade was one of the most profitable enterprises known to humankind. You can invest $1 and get $1,700 back. There are those who would sell their firstborn child for 1,700% profit, let alone an African they did not know. And then, of course, speaking of the latter, reminds us of the ideological infrastructure that was undergirding slavery and the African slave trade. That is to say, this notion of anti-blackness, this notion of racism, layered upon white supremacy, etc., which, according to some, had a biblical grounding in Christianity. So there were many reasons why this was such a formidable enterprise.
Mm. There's been a lot of pushback, especially from more like traditional Americans, like traditional American historians, people who are more fond, especially on the right, about your writings, particularly about the American Revolution and your portrayal of it. What is your sort of response to their sayings? Like, because a lot of them do believe that genuinely the American Revolution was about liberty or freedom or, I don't know, some bull crap like that.
Well, I'm not sure if even some of our friends on the left recognize that our understanding of the past evolves.
Mm,
That is to say, W.E.B. Du Bois, who you're probably familiar with when he wrote Black Reconstruction, a revisiting of the series of reforms following the U.S. Civil War, 1865 to 1877. Prior to Du Bois's work in the 1930s, Reconstruction was portrayed as a devilish era of Negro misrule. Du Bois objected, and now his view is seen as the consensus. You're having something similar today, for example, with regard to the Enlightenment. For example, this idea that in Europe there was this progressive trend that was pushing back against religious obscurantism, pushing back against monarchy, the divine right of kings. But I just interviewed a scholar, William Max Nelson, the University of Toronto. And he, of course, is one of the many scholars today who are revising the traditional understanding of the Enlightenment. I suggest to you his book, Enlightenment Biopolitics, which he argues in part that the Enlightenment, among other things, led to sharper divisions amongst humankind. It basically involved, in part, a way in which people of African descent could be ushered out of the human family. Which brings me to another sub theme of a good deal of my work that some of the critics have not picked up on. What I mean by that is, for many in the United States in particular, you could wake them up in the middle of the night and they'd begin to babble and prate and prattle about the real and imagined abilities and weaknesses of socialism. But it's hard to think of any in the United States who have a critique of republicanism, that is to say, anti monarchy, even though we know that anti monarchy and republicanism basically involve a sort of evolution, if you like, from the divine right of monarchs to the divine right of men of European descent, particularly property means, and then fast forwarding to the era of Mr. Trump's favorite president, Andrew Jackson, to men of European descent generally. Nelson points out that in France, which was seen as the epicenter of the Enlightenment, women as a category were not granted a certain kind of citizenship until the 1940s. And he did not say this, but I infer from that a lot of that had to do with the revolt against the Nazi occupation, which helps to unleash progressive trends. And in the book I'll be publishing in a few months on the counter revolution of 1893, obviously it's part of a trilogy involving US history. This one involves the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy and by Hollies or men of European descent, who then established an apartheid state. And that leads directly to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, the United States entering World War II against Imperial Japan. And so, obviously, it's well past time with the critique aforementioned of socialism as a sort of precedent to revisit these hallowed concepts, such as 1776, such as republicanism, for example.
So I, I find that to be a really, thank you for such a fantastic illustrative example. It actually strikes me because I'm a particular fan of the literature of Proust, and in particular, the way he highlights how our memory has such a profound impact on our personal lives and the way we conceive of ourselves. And it struck me as a bit of a metaphor. And I wanted to metaphor for hagiography and historiography, especially within nation states. And I wanted to ask you, what are some of the key mechanisms that you see really underpinning that effort to justify hierarchies of today, to understand history in a way that is convenient for those in power? Is it all about naturalization and sort of looking back in history and saying, well, look, it was like this, and therefore um, that rationalizes the current state of things today? Or is there something more complex going on there? Or are there multiple things going on?
Well, it's not just people in power. I mean, I was referring to people on the left. They hardly
Mm,
have influence, not to mention not engaged in power. I think
mm.
this is what people are taught, and it rings a bell. And what I find particularly troubling in the United States is the overlooking of indigenous genocide. I mean, I've been spending a lot of time examining the genocide against the indigenous population. For example, in my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836 on Texas, Slavery and Jim Crow, a major theme is the genocide inflicted against the indigenous population. And every time I look at secondary literature or begin to explore the primary sources on the question of indigenous genocide, I'm always taken aback. I mean, for example, just yesterday, I was in Eugene, Oregon. And of course, the Pacific Northwest is seen to be a bastion of progressivism. But I had thought that one could not exceed the bloodthirstiness of the settlers of Texas until I started looking at the Pacific Northwest, for example. And what's striking about this, and it should be intuitively obvious, is that the genocidal impulse was in many ways emerging from the grassroots. That is to say, landless Europeans wanting the land of the indigenous and then pushing to make sure that happens, up to and including organizing armed bands to oust the indigenous from their land. And I think that when we arrive at a new consensus about the horrors of genocide, to answer your question more pointedly, I think that there will be analysts and scholars who will be able to argue that many who were overlooking this question of genocide in the making of the United States of America, that somehow they thought that they were benefiting or their ancestors were benefiting, for example.
Yeah.
And I think, and then if you want to turn that coin over, myself being a descendant of enslaved Africans uh, who emerged in the heart of darkness of slavery that is Mississippi. I grew up on stories about how terrible Mississippi was from my parents. Uh, it still strikes a chord when I think of how my mother was telling me that they had to get off the sidewalks when a settler was approaching, for example. Uh,
So cultural hegemony comes from the middle class and the grassroots and the settlers who came who wanted to steal land and um, benefit from that, much the way we see today, in the West Bank, in Israel, and that kind of process. And so I find that really compelling because it's the class interests of the settlers as well that trickle up into this a cultural hegemony, which then defines a narrative of history. Um, it's not just some top down kind of ruling class interest, and that's something we really need to reckon with as a settler society, as a society founded on genocide and the destruction of an entire collection of societies and civilizations. What do you think are and on the radical left, it's certainly a topic of considerable presence, but how would you articulate the specific challenges facing progressive change and revolution, or just progressive change in general in a society like the United States, given such historical circumstances? Is it just about understanding history differently, or should we understand this in an organizational capacity as well?
well, certainly we need more organizing. But a theme I've been stressing of late is that settler colonialism involves class collaboration. If you go back to my book on the 16th century and you examine what I wrote about Londoners establishing settlements in the 1580s and what they called North Carolina, that they were sponsored by the 1% in London, but those crossing the Atlantic were a heterogeneous mixture of declassed elements, shopkeepers, workers, etc. And you can't begin to understand the vote in November 2024 when Mr. Trump gets 77 million votes without understanding class collaboration. Part of what I've been trying to stress is that oftentimes when we veered in this country from the path of class collaboration to progressivism, it oftentimes has been in the context of a different international dispensation. For example, the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, igniting a general crisis of the slave system, uh, which then entices and induces London to abolish its role in the African slave trade by 1807 on the wise premise that it did not make sense to bring more grave diggers across the Atlantic to Jamaica, Barbados, etc. And then London begins to pressure its former colony, speaking of the United States of America, and some of the direction, oftentimes in league with Haitian revolutionaries. I've written at length about that. And then if you look at the retreat of Jim Crow in the middle of the 20th century, it's induced in no small measure by the rise of a socialist camp, which then is wooing the dispossessed and the colonies of the European powers. Washington found it difficult to appeal to hearts and minds in Africa, Asia, and Latin America in particular, as that kind of wooing was taking place. That creates objective conditions for the retreat and the erosion of Jim Crow in this country. But it's sometimes forgotten that there was militant protests against the retreat from Jim Crow. President Eisenhower in 1957 had to send armed battalions into Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, in order to protect Black kids from being mauled by parents and teenagers, for example. You had a similar process at Ole Miss, University of Mississippi in Oxford, 1962. It was sectional. If you look at the Boston revolt against busing in the 1970s, if you look at the revolt against housing desegregation in Yonkers, New York in the 1980s, for example, by the way, depicted quite dramatically in the movie Show Me a Hero. And what we see today is that those who were repulsed in the 50s and the 60s and 70s and 80s now have their champion in the Copperhead that is Mr. Trump. And I mentioned Copperhead intentionally because during the U.S. Civil War, you had pro-Confederate sentiment in New York City. Those were the Copperheads. So if you go to YouTube and extract the scene from the Scorsese DiCaprio movie Gangs of New York about the pogrom against Black people in Manhattan during the height of the U.S. Civil War, I'm sure you'll be shocked and appalled by that expression of Copperhead sentiment. So I think that many of my friends on the left, they have this very romanticized view of the United States of America. I mean, excuse me for chuckling because it's really quite tragic because you can, as a matter of fact, I've begun to think of the United States, not as the USA, United States of America, but the United States of anomalies. Everything is an anomaly. It's like Obama used to say, that's not who we are, when there would be shootings in Connecticut of school children, for example. Well, I'm sorry. That's exactly who we are. And until we own up to it, I think it'll lead to a tragic situation where we'll have a lot to discuss in the concentration camps.
Professor Horne, I've always found your perspective on fascism also very enlightening. And a lot of our liberal colleagues on the left really don't seem to understand why it is arising within America. And if I could glean from a lot of your work, I think a lot of your work suggests, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, that fascism is really homegrown. It comes from our own settler-tariat sort of conditions. Why do you think that's so hard for the left to understand? And what do you think that in this moment, particularly, it is arising to such a visible degree, whereas before it was like, during the Obama era, things like that, it was sort of quiet.
Well, it's slowly gaining strength and momentum, not least because of global currents, the rise of Farage and the so-called Reform Party in the UK, the rise of the so-called National Front of Le Pen in France, the Nazi Curious Alternative for Germany party in Deutschland, for example. The fact that many of these forces are in tune with the United States of America. And of course, the United States of America, as I said, uh, it, you have a particularly weak left, you have a particularly weak trade union movement. You had many of our liberal forces who participated in the 1950s in the Red Scare, helping to purge those to their left. I'm thinking of the labor movement, the AFL-CIO, and their ouster of West Coast Longshore under the leadership of Australian Harry Bridges on the grounds that he was supposedly a communist, the purge of the left from the NAACP. And surprise, surprise, and now that the left has been weakened, you see that the right wing is going after the liberals. Lisa Cook, the Federal Reserve banker, being threatened with imprisonment on mortgage fraud grounds. Letitia James, the Attorney General of the state of New York, similar grounds. Adam Schiff, the senator from California, similar grounds. Mr. Trump has said that his predecessor, Barack Obama, should be charged with treason, which is perhaps one of the most diabolical crimes one can be accused of. And so, in some ways, what's happening in the United States is unfolding according to a hoary script. That is to say, the liberals join with the right in purging the left. The left is weakened, and now the right is going after the liberals. I mean, it's utterly predictable.
Mhm. Within this equation, do you feel as though the liberals are sort of opening the door for fascists? They're collaborators, or are they like unknowing allies, like accidentally?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that scenario I just sketched, where liberals participate in the purging of the left in league with the right, and now the right is going after the liberals. Because what you need to realize about the United States is that if you look at the Civil War, for example, 1861 to 1865, the Lincoln government was basically behind the eight ball until the Emancipation Proclamation, which was basically a war fighting measure, January 1st, 1863, which allowed the Lincoln government to enlist 200,000 black men. And that turned out to be a turning point in terms of defeating of the Confederate States of America. The Civil War also illustrates class collaboration insofar as the foot soldiers of the slave owning class were oftentimes non-slave owning Euro-American men, for example. And they were fighting to preserve a system, slavery, that served as a drag on their wages and on their working conditions. But I guess they felt that they could become enslavers as well, and ultimately profit. And of course, the stories were legion of that happening. I'm doing a study now of Mississippi slavery, and it's striking to note that perhaps the most formidable slave owner in Mississippi, the Heart of Darkness, as I just said, Stephen Duncan, one of the richest men in the world, one of the biggest enslavers, was actually against secession because he thought, contrary to liberal principles, that the Constitution protected slavery. So I think that part of our dilemma is a rather blinkered view of the past based upon blinkered ideology, blinkered presuppositions, all of which is leading us to the brink of catastrophe.
I think it's been very interesting to see the reaction on the Marxist-Leninist left to the rise of fascism in the European Union and the United States. And I suppose the explanation that has always been seen as the most compelling is just that there's a tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and all of these various measures of globalizing supply chains, neoliberalism, austerity, all of that has staved off the inevitable crisis of capitalism, and that fascism and white nationalism and this really unrepentant, militant kind of politics is returning as the last resort to kind of manage the crisis of the capitalist system. Do you think that that is a sensible Marxist or Marxist-Leninist analysis, or do you think that that too misses a lot?
Well, it's both. I mean, I think there's something to that argument, but in the United States, if you talk about fascism, you don't talk about the history of this country with genocide and mass enslavement and take
Yeah,
that for
we're
granted
very, very limited. Yeah,
and sweep it under the rug. I mean, you're missing quite a bit. Plus, uh, right before he died in 1994, U.S. President Richard M. Nixon said that his overtures to China might have created a, quote, Frankenstein monster, unquote. In other words, uh, there was a kind of overdetermination of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And that's a part of the strength and weakness of not only the US ruling class, but perhaps the US left as well, to the extent that the ruling ideas of any society are those of the ruling class. That is to say, the single minded focus. And they threw everything they had at the Soviet Union, including this deal with China, which then opened the door for massive foreign direct investment, which has created this juggernaut. And you saw the military parade just a few days ago in Beijing, which left many in Washington slack-jawed. And in fact, perhaps you gentlemen can shed light on this. There was a political report that said that the new national defense strategy of U.S. imperialism is going to prioritize the Western Hemisphere. And
Latin.
we had thought, have you heard of that argument? It was just published in the last few days. And of course, that sheds light on the gunboat diplomacy towards Venezuela, for example. It sheds light on Marco Rubio, the national security advisor and secretary of state, and his frequent jaunts to El Salvador, his phobia, his obsession about his erstwhile homeland, speaking of socialist Cuba. But in any case, there's quite a bit of pressure on U.S. imperialism right now. And I think that that's led directly to the erratic policies of the Trump regime, alienating India, for example, which we saw on display in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in China just a few days ago. These There's a headline in the New York Times today that says something like Brazil tells the United States to get lost, he said, which is reflection of the alienation of this gigantic neighbor to the south based upon Mr. Trump's cheerleading
Mhm.
for the recently convicted ex-president Bolsonaro, who tried to not only execute a coup but murder the winner, Lula da Silva. The pressure on Canada, which is quite extraordinary, uh, the 51st state, as Mr. Trump would have it, the pressure on Greenland and seizing Greenland, which has led President Macron to appear in Greenland shoulder to shoulder with his Danish colleagues. So U.S. imperialism is under pressure right now. It reminds me of the Munich Security Conference just a few months ago, uh, where Vice President Vance read the Riot Act to the Europeans, basically saying, stop cracking down on these neo fascists. Otherwise, you're violating free speech. And the guy who followed him to the podium, some German guy, he burst into tears when he when he got to the podium. I mean, these people are having a collective nervous breakdown. And I think this is what happens when you see a system that had been taken for granted, imperialism, neoliberalism, neocolonialism, is beginning to show fissures, beginning to exhibit signs of a crack up, that it leads to erratic policies, it leads to blunders. It's like a basketball team that's put under pressure. Oftentimes it throws the ball away repeatedly. And I think that that's the metaphor that you can use to apply to U.S. imperialism.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
found a lot of cool. Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say every time China builds like a port in Latin America, the news headlines say China's building a port in our backyard. But hey, it's on our backyard, like it's crazy. But go ahead, Henry.
I think that, it's funny. A lot of liberals in particular said that, oh, Trump is so stupid. He doesn't even understand how important India is. He doesn't understand that he's alienating them. And I just kept thinking, no, he understands perfectly well. This is an act of desperation. This is an act of desperation to put pressure on Russia. They're doing all these things as, trying to lower interest rates at the Federal Reserve, and probably going to cause, 20% inflation. They're doing this because there's such an accumulation of debt and they need to figure out the debt problem and borrow money, so all extremely desperate measures, the measures of a stupid child. I mean, in fact, it's the reactionaries that have a serious understanding of how deep the crisis runs. But I wanted to, if you have any issue with what I said, I'd love to hear it. But I wanted to drill down in particular on something you, I think, quite correctly pointed out, which is the original fascist nature and the continuing fascist nature of the United States throughout its entire history. Um, and I think the subject of defining fascism is interesting because to take Germany, you have another often forgotten genocide in Namibia that was done under the German Empire. But of course, there was a distinct shift that occurred when Hitler came and the Nazi Party came to power, where people would normally say this is the beginning of fascism. So how, especially in a country like the United States, can we understand that shift to a more authoritarian, militarized a kind of governance where there's no pretense of bourgeois liberal democracy, while also recognizing the very real experience of fascism by people who are subaltern or colonized peoples.
Well, if you just look at the Anglo Project, as noted, beginning in the 1580s in what we call North Carolina, and trace the Anglo Project from there to the revolt against British rule in 1776, the establishment of the United States of America up until the present. So you had this brief window from what I argue is the Compromise of 1954, whereby in return for the liberals tossing overboard those to their left, like the late great Paul Robeson, you had an agonizing or reluctant retreat from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But as noted, that those epical events were largely driven by global trends, and now you've had a shift in the global correlation of forces. And so therefore you've had a recrudescence of what characterized the Anglo project from its inception, which was genocide. It wasn't as if there were democratic rights extended to all. I mean, if you look at the vaunted Bill of Rights and the Second Amendment, which is causing so much grief nowadays, the Second Amendment was not extended to the indigenous. As a matter of fact, a strategic objective of the settlers was to keep weapons out of the arms of the indigenous, just like a strategic objective was to keep arms out of the hands of the enslaved population, for example. And I think part of the problem is our friends on the left, excuse me for chuckling, but it's just so naive. I have to laugh. If there are Europeans who are discriminated against in Europe and they come here and they do not face the same level of discrimination, such as the Catholic population in the UK, for example, the Jewish population throughout Western Europe, and their extended rights here, since our friends on the left, they don't understand necessarily the construction of whiteness, even though there's been a small library of writings about it, including by myself, they assume that the uplifting of the Catholics, despite the Know-Nothing movement of the 1850s, which of course was violently anti-Catholic, despite spasms of anti-Semitism throughout this country, they think the uplifting of these populations serves as a precedent for the uplifting of the rest of us, when actually the uplifting of those populations in many ways is designed to strengthen the regressive nature of the settler project, for example. In my book on Southern California, just published last year, I pointed out that one of the early settlers in what is now San Diego, California, happened to be Jewish. And of course, he received many emoluments. But of course, he had a reputation as an Indian fighter. I mean, if you look at the Confederate States of America, the so-called brains of the Confederate States of America was Judah P. Benjamin, for example. If you look at the state of Florida, one of the leading senators pre-Civil War was Senator Yulee, Y-U-L-E-E. And that might ring a bell for National Football League fans, because the bruising running back of the Baltimore Ravens, Derrick Henry, hails from Yulee, Florida, for example. So I think that bad historical analysis, inadequate historical analysis, oftentimes leads to inadequate policies, bad policies. But fortunately, all is not lost, because you're beginning to see slowly but surely a burgeoning anti-fascist movement in this country. Certainly not rapid enough for most of us. I'm looking at the demonstrations, the No Kings demonstration in mid-June 2025 in the United States, for example. I'm looking at the dissent emerging from the 1% or the 0.00001%. The Financial Times of London had a front page story a few days ago about Ray Dalio, D-A-L-I-O, the hedge fund billionaire from Connecticut, who says that what's happening in the United States reminds him of Europe in the 1930s. Ken Griffin, South Florida, another card-carrying member of the U.S. ruling class, has been critical of Trump of late. Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, the Yale School of Management, who styles himself as a CEO whisperer, says that the CEOs he knows, they whisper in his ear that they're opposed to Trump policies, but they're intimidated and therefore do not speak out. And actually, given the fact that Senator Murkowski of Alaska conceded a few weeks ago that a lot of the senators and congresspersons, they're scared stiff. They're afraid to speak out because fascism in this country, just like slavery and what I described about the seizing of the land of the indigenous in the Pacific Northwest, has a mass base. And it's not just a few billionaires at the top. It's a class collaboration. It's a cross-class project. And that's what should have us all riveted and concerned.
Yeah, that's a key point, I think, and it's a very key point. And I think the emphasis that fascism is astroturfed by the organic, and is a kind of organic intellectualism of the ruling class definitely misses that. But doesn't it still ultimately come out of class struggle? Because, if you look at a case, such a meticulously documented case of colonization like the West Bank and Israel, it is still ultimately class struggle that drives this sort of frontier expansion, right? Because you have people who are squeezed, by the class contradiction, and then those people go out and say, "Well, I'm desperate. Am I going to fight the capitalists? No, I'll go steal land from these defenseless people, and the state will help me do it." So, and of course, there's a vested interest to foster that kind of solution and resolution to the class contradiction by the ruling class. So, while it might be mistaken to say that it's all just uh, hypnotizing the workers into just, being bad people, and they're all secretly really great people, and they're all proletarians, that's, a fantasy. But do you think that it's acceptable to understand it in the context of class contradiction solely?
Well, I wouldn't say solely, but
Mhm.
certainly substantially. I mean, for example, I think I've written about this. If you look at the experience of the Cherokee of the southeast quadrant of North America, many of them sought to assimilate up to and including becoming sedentary agriculturalists, converting Christianity, owning enslaved Africans, but they still had to go. And they still in the 1820s were forced to march on gunpoint into Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. And you had Europeans fresh off the boat who could move into their mansions and just sweep the floor and just move in. And so there were benefits accruing. I mean, it reminds me of some of the reading I've done about the Nazi Germany, whereby the Nazis would plunder and then some of their supporters would reap some of the benefits, for example. Uh, and you had the same thing in Imperial Japan when they were looting Hong Kong in the 1940s, for example. And I think part of the problem, once again, is that with regard to the class question in the United States, it's oftentimes misunderstood. I mean, for example, uh, I characterize the enslaved population oftentimes as the unpaid sector of the working class, and that by objective circumstance, they were forced into class struggle because when you don't get paid, it tends to lead to revolt up to and including trying to severely wound the state, which I talk about in my latest book, The Capital of Slavery, August 1814, when the enslaved population joined the British in torching Washington, D.C., and then escaped on boats to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. And I think oftentimes, you have these nebulous terms. I don't know where these people get these nebulous terms, like identity politics. I'm not sure what that means. I mean, I criticize Senator Bernie Sanders, for example, because he ascribed the victory of the Republicans in November of 2024 to identity politics. I'm not sure what he means by that, particularly since Zionism is the highest state of identity politics, if that term means anything. He used to live in Israel. I've never heard anybody on the US left use the descriptor identity politics to apply to Zionism. They oftentimes apply it to communities that are under siege, like the Black community, the trans community. But if you look at the Black community, what they call identity politics is a legacy of class solidarity, for example. Uh, Huddling together against an oftentimes vicious majority, for example. And instead of saluting that kind of solidarity and trying to protect oneself against the depredations of the state in terms of police terror by organizing movements like Black Lives Matter, our friends on the left instead defame these movements by saying that they're identity politics. Although they don't say what does that mean?
Yeah.
Come
Um,
on,
um,
people.
cutting you off super quick, Professor Horn. Uh, a lot of fascism right now, it does come through dog whistles like identity politics, right? That's how it's usually presented. It's like, oh, I'm not a fascist. Even Donald Trump, in his most recent address after Mr. Kirk was ended, he said, we're often called Nazis, right? They often accuse us of being Nazis, the radical left, and that's what leads to things like this. Why do you think they need to use dog whistles like identity politics? Is it because there is a lot of strength still from the civil rights era and they're slowly but surely dismantling it? Why can't they just come out openly? Why do they have to hide behind these like dog whistles?
Well, as I said, it's not the U.S. left uses these descriptors quite a bit, for example. And as I said, I think the part of the problem is that I think some of our friends on the left recall what I just said about the U.S. Civil War just a few moments ago, how the right wing was prevailing until the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863. I think instinctively that there's a recognition that in order for the non-conservatives to prevail, they need a black community united behind them, for example. And if, from their point of view, if the black community is engaged in movements like Black Lives Matter, that means that there's necessarily going to be sort of foot soldiers and sort of liberal-led movement, for example. And so therefore you have to apply these negative descriptors like identity politics to get them to shape up and line up behind the liberals, for example. But I think it's time for liberals and those oftentimes to the left of liberals, and let's be clear, I'm speaking mostly of Euro Americans, to face up to the history of this country. I mean, to face up to settler colonialism. As a matter of fact, I'm surprised. Well, I'm not surprised. I'm struck by the reality that settler colonialism, is a term from the U.S. left, it tends to be applied more to Israel than the United States of America. And if I were an Israeli patriot, given the current trends, I'm surprised that they don't see it. That's anti-Semitism. How dare you use the term settler colonialism with regard to historic Palestine and not with regard to North America? It's just like Mr. Netanyahu once said about the West Bank. He said Israel will return the West Bank to the Palestinians when the United States returns California, Texas to the Mexicans, for example. And those are bitter concepts that we need to interrogate.
Besides, yeah, going to that example, especially, besides like obviously the economic benefits to having Israel as an ally, there also seems to be such an ideological connection between America and Israel. They almost seem to be so ideologically wed, where it seems impossible for America to shed Israel. It's they're intertwined, their histories, everything. Um, and yet, what like you said, our left is unable to encapsulate that we are Israel's success project, essentially. Um, why do you think that is so hard for them to accept? Is it just because it would mean, well, I'm a settler, and then our narratives are less simple, or is it something deeper than that, such as holding on to chauvinism, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, maybe all of the above.
Mm.
As I've tried to suggest, I think that the understanding of the past is abysmal in this country. I mean, I think of people, and I won't mention any names, but who really should know better, given their intelligence, given their familiarity with historical sources. But I think there's a certain amount of opportunism involved. And I think that settler colonialism tends to breed right opportunism. It tends to breed an opportunism that capitulates to the status quo, for
Yeah.
example. And also, speaking subjectively, I think you make a solid point when you suggest that settler descendants don't like to be described as settler descendants because that's not the kind of heroism or lack thereof that they're aspiring towards. So it's a we're really dealing with complex topics of history, psychology, privilege, etc.
Yeah, I think you should name names. Which is a drama podcast. No. But it's funny because it's really shocking. I mean, I was interested in radical politics from a very young age and grew up in a suburban, entirely white community, basically, in a well-off neighborhood. And, I got very interested in land back, and indigenous rights, at a younger age. And, I would be so struck, would talk to whether it was my parents or people at school or so on. And I could talk about land back and the very reasonable demands that are often leveled by indigenous people and organizations. And it quickly is shut down by this bizarre fear that this means we're just going to, all the white people are going to get killed. It's really strange, and it's funny because the colonizers always seem to have the perception that they will be treated by the colonized as they have treated them. Like it's naturalized to the extent that they really get this idea in their head somehow that, if it's not them, it'll be us. And it creates this kind of culture of perpetuating that, more and more. But is there a way to, and I don't have any answer at all, and I'm still quite young, but is there a way to, in your view, break people out of that? Is that something we should be concerned with, if we're interested in class war in the United States? Is there any way that reframing history can shape these kinds of psychological mechanisms that are so deeply colonial? Or do you have any other thoughts?
Well, that's the $64 question, is it not? It reminds me of other settler societies, for example. In Australia, land acknowledgement is quite common. Uh, I mean, if you go to C-SPAN and excuse me, go to YouTube and tune into some of the elite discussions on Australian foreign policy right now, which is a very burning question because they're having to come to grips with the rise in China. Oftentimes, they begin with land acknowledgements. We're talking about elite forces, not to mention working class forces. In Canada, for example, and I'm doing a project right now. It's part of the Pacific Northwest Project, which is comparative settler colonialism. And in Canada, in the what is the Canada, Canadian Southwest, what we would call the Pacific Northwest, the initial project was extractive colonialism. That is to say, working with the indigenous population with regard to fur and timber. And it was the United States across the border that was embarked on a project of settler colonialism, which meant ousting the indigenous from the land. And so it's no secret that First Nations, as they're called in Canada, have more influence and power north of the border than south of the border. Although supposedly this is the revolutionary republic that had this grand revolutionary Republican project in 1776, the likes of which we have not seen before or since. And I think that part of the problem in the United States is an overvaluation of 1776. Now, in many writings and programs that I've appeared on, I've talked about a discernible trend that has appeared in the Black community, which is quite critical of the founding of the United States of America. I mean, if you look at perhaps the most garlanded Black historian of the late 20th century, early 21st century, Tyler Stovall of UC Berkeley, his book White Freedom in many ways tracks my work. If you look at the documentary by the former Haitian Minister of Culture, Raoul Peck, Exterminate All the Brutes, which got quite significant distribution in this country, it's a sweeping castigation of settler colonialism, a term, as I said, that's generally conspicuously missing from the ordinary vocabulary of many of our friends on the left. So I think that what we're doing now is part of the spade work that's necessary to try to turn the left around, to turn the country around, I'm confident that we'll be able to do so, but it will take a struggle.
Mm.
Mm.
Um, why do you think America is so unique compared to other liberal societies, in that it's completely unreformable to some degree? We've still held on to the same constitution that we do had since 1776. Even though, amendments have been added, it's still largely the same framework. While, European nations will go through constitutions on the flip of a dime. What do you think America is so resistant to change, even change that would stabilize liberal society?
Well, once again, I think it's an overvaluation of what happened in the late 18th century, a sentiment that is shared across ideological lines by left, right, and center, for example. And then, of course, there's a sort of cherry picking as well with regard to this so called originalism and textualism of constitutional adjudication. For example, you go back to the late 18th century Constitution as amended by the Bill of Rights, but you don't deal with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which Professor Sinha of University of Connecticut has suggested inaugurated a new republic, a second republic. But that those amendments are not considered in the same originalist textualism context that the 1787 Constitution is viewed. And obviously, that's a reflection of conservatism. It's a reflection of the strength of conservatism across uh, class lines amongst the settler descendant population, for example. It's reflected in the fact that uh, the settler descendant population is quite substantial, still has a substantial majority. It reminds me of when you look at Native American sentiments in the 19th century, that they're just astonished and astounded by the continuing flood of settlers. And of course, this is construction of whiteness, which allows the Republicans to sweep within their ambit those who, as noted, had been discriminated against in Europe, Catholics, the Jewish population, those who had been warring on the shores of Europe, Polish versus Russian, Polish versus German, English versus Scots, English versus Irish, French Protestants against French Catholics, Northern Italians versus Southern Italians, Serbs versus Croats. When they crossed the Atlantic, they all rebranded as white in the maneuver that would make Madison Avenue blush. And somehow, despite the invention of this term, identity politics, the construction of whiteness is not seen as identity politics, for example, even though it's clearly a kind of new world identity that brings political privilege and oftentimes economic privilege. And so, once again, the ideological weaknesses and indeed backwardness that obtains in this country is one explanation why we're staring down the barrel of fascism as we speak.
It's striking. I got very interested in the psychology of architecture, and the philosophy of architecture at one point, and I remember just driving around in the suburban community and just thinking everything around here just insists on itself. You've got these massive, ugly buildings, huge malls, massive parking lots. It's almost like there's just this insistence that, this we're here, that it's sort of this like almost a literal imposition on the land. Um, and I mean, do you think that some of the obsession with 1776 has to do with that, and just the idea that you can establish a beginning of the nation states and the beginning, and we can sort of repress the understanding of indigeneity, and the existence of indigenous people sort of into some Jungian um, uh, deep recess of the mind, and then create all these mechanisms to suppress it. Do you think that that bleeds into hagiography and the historiography of the United States at all?
Well, I think that implicitly the idea is that the creation of the United States was such a great leap forward for humanity that ultimately, at some point, it will come to include those who were excluded, such as the indigenous population. And let's not look at the mountain of cadavers that precedes this point that's supposedly in the future. Uh, let's not deal with the millions of Africans buried at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, uh, in the Middle Passage, not to mention the unpaid labor that went to construct this republic. Obviously, this is a sort of mind blowing version of white supremacy, racial privilege, etc. And it would be not difficult to infer from what I've said to this point that the rulers of this country and those who tail after them are making the determination that just as there was a sort of racialized bludgeoning of the indigenous population and the African population, that in the 21st century, uh, the remit is being expanded to include any who would object to their misrule beyond the indigenous and beyond the African. In fact, the idea would be to co-opt some of the Black population in particular. So this is the state of play. It's I don't want to conclude on a grim and glum note, but at the same time, I think we cannot afford a Pollyanna point of view at this late stage of the game. And let me once again reiterate that I'm confident that we'll be able to overcome. And it's not just because we've been able to overcome in the past. I'm confident that we can overcome because I see global currents blowing in our direction that are positive. We're facing we're facing certain headwinds domestically, but tailwinds globally. And I think that the latter will overcome the former.
Professor Horne, you mentioned co-option, and one odd trend I've noticed is the revitalization within the mainstream of the Buffalo Soldiers. Beyonce was wearing a shirt that said something along the line of Buffalo Soldiers, and she made a post where it's like the Savages, get the Savages, and the Buffalo Soldiers, of course, were a black regiment that were used to kill indigenous people. Um, and then, of course, another weird sort of co-option I've noticed is that within the right wing, a lot of them are Latino, like within white supremacist spaces. Nick Fuentes, for example, is like half Mexican American. Why do you think that this is so important to the fascist project? That we get some in groups within our group to play off of others.
And Kanye West, of course.
Kanye West,
Well,
yeah.
I think they feel the need to augment their ranks. For example, I think that it's rather slick, is it not, to bash diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's coming from the non-conservative side, but to practice it on your side, for example, that seems to be a rather sophisticated stratagem that some of our folks on this side of the barricades have not been able to overcome. And speaking of the Buffalo Soldiers, it reminds me of the late comic Richard Pryor, who said, he told black people, we should be quiet about the Buffalo Soldiers. You want the Indians to hate us too? I mean, basically. And it's something obviously not worth glorifying. But at the same time, of course, at the moment, it seems as if emoluments and benefits can be gleaned from going along with the status quo. And it may be asking too much for certain communities that have faced hell on earth for centuries not to be seduced by that. Fortunately, as noted, we're only talking about a sliver of that community.
Mhm.
And, despite all of this rhetoric, uh, if the U.S. population had voted like the black population, for example, 7-3 or 8-2 against the right wing, Trump would be in an orange jumpsuit, not in the White House.
Yeah, and it's a bizarre position to be in, as a Marxist Leninist, where the global, like you said, the global tide seems to be on our side, but obviously domestically there's massive obstacles, and I think we really appreciate your message of clarity and insight as well as optimism. It reminds me a lot of uh, probably one of my favorite quotes from Gramsci, who said, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. So I really appreciate you taking the time with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. Professor Gerald Horne, if there's any things you would like to plug, like books, and if you have any last words before you go, please do so now.
Well, let's see. I'm doing a book signing October 10th for my latest book, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865, October 10th in Brooklyn, Sister's Place on Nostrand Avenue, October 17th at Montgomery College in Silver Spring, Maryland, same time. And of course, that's about it.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming on. Your perspective was very insightful, and we're big fans. Thank you for listening to the Pokepreet podcast. If you want to support our podcast, you can always head down to our Patreon, where you can get episodes up to a month early. Workers of the world unite. Long live the immortal science of Marxist Leninism. Thank you.